So to start out by telling you how I got into this, I started out as a bench researcher, which I know many of you guys are well familiar with or do now. And I loved the fact that in basic science, we have this power to ask these innovative and interesting questions about biological systems, how they work, and how new approaches might impact and change the way we treat human disease. But it didn't take me very long in academia to realize that although academia is very powerful for discovery, a lot of the things we were discovering ultimately resulted in publications or grants, but didn't necessarily make it out of the lab. And I knew that's what I was really interested in doing, seeing some of these exciting scientific innovations impact real people. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe what I should do is become a doctor so I can see science impact people and help treat medical conditions in novel ways. And it seemed to me at the time that the fastest way to see what it was like to be a doctor was to become a medical scribe. So that's what I did. I became a medical scribe in internal medicine, which meant that I shadowed a physician through her appointments and kept her notes and got to witness the one-on-one interaction that the physician had with all of her patients. And what I realized from that was two things. Number one, that we were constantly seeing patients who had run out of therapeutic options, whether that was a stage 4 cancer patient or an Alzheimer's patient or a patient with a rare disease. There were so many people that had run out of medical options. And second, I realized that the physician was severely limited as to what she could do for patients by the medicines that exist. And from that, putting those two experiences together, I witnessed this two-sided problem, where on the one hand, there was an innovation gap. More new medicines were needed by patients. On the other hand, there was a translation gap, where there were exciting medical innovations with the potential to impact disease in novel ways. But a lot of times, those innovations weren't actually making it out of the lab. So at this point, I want to take a quick break from my story to talk a little bit about business. So when I was solely a scientist, I told people and thought to myself, I'm not interested in business because business is about money and I don't really care about money, or I'm not motivated by that. And it turned out that although that's not entirely untrue, a good business can't actually make money unless it's solving a problem. And if I can leave you with one thing today, I hope it can be this, which is that businesses solve problems, and good businesses are the best problem solvers. And new companies and startups have historically been an incredible way to bring solutions to problems by bringing new ideas to the market where people can actually access them. So to go over that quickly, some non-biotech examples: Uber and Lyft, of course, everyone knows them. I hear you even have it here in Penn State, which is very exciting. When I was in college in Ithaca, New York, there was no Uber and Lyft, which was very unfortunate for getting me to class on time. However, the point is that before Uber and Lyft, of course, people in cities were faced with a problem. Although public transit was available, it can be very slow and inefficient depending on where you were going. On the other hand, it can be very expensive and not super practical to own a car. And of course, the solution to that problem was ride sharing. And the fact that almost everyone in the country and out of the country knows about these two companies, and most people have those apps, speaks to the fact that this business was a solution, an effective solution to a problem that so many people had. And while getting to profitability is a different question, what I want to focus on is the fact that because their business was an effective, novel approach to a problem that people had, they were able to earn revenue and have customers and thus be a successful business. To quickly go over one more example, talk about Southwest. So to start out with just a fact, airlines are one of the most unprofitable businesses there are. That's historically how they've been thought about, and largely that is true. That's for multiple reasons, including the high prices to just simply operate an airline, the cost of capital equipment, maintaining those planes. And although we always feel, I'm sure, every time you fly, like you are handing half your paycheck to the airline, unfortunately, their costs are so high that it doesn't always even out. And a lot of times airlines run for years being unprofitable. And so at the time when Southwest came around, there was a problem. which was that flying was pretty much unaffordable for the, let's call it, the average American family who wanted to travel for leisure, not for work, and their companies weren't floating the costs. And it was pretty expensive to fly with your whole family. And so Southwest realized that because the airlines that existed, the airlines that today are called United, Delta, American, etc., that those airlines were thinking about this problem in a very traditional way, which was they thought that everyone who flies, of course, needs a meal, they need a really big seat, they need this first class treatment, and that's obviously what they're looking for. So we can charge a premium price, and that's how we'll make money. Southwest realized that if they could engage the people that were left out of the market, the flying market, that they could have an effective business. And so they rethought the airline business model. Instead of flying out of major airports at business hours, they flew out of smaller airports at off hours so that they could pay lower costs. They also pack more people onto an airplane. They don't have a first class section, and they have a lower price. They don't serve meals. That's very common today, but at the time that was novel. They also did a whole thing where they slashed regulation, or they came around right after a bunch of regulations were slashed in Texas, which allowed them to do a different sort of flight model. And all that to say, Southwest has historically been one of the, or if not the most profitable airline ever. Even in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when most airlines were getting government bailouts, Southwest was the only airline with an Altman Z-score, which is a measure of the likelihood of bankruptcy, in the healthy range. And that is just an example of the power of building a business that is solving a problem for people. Not to mention that my fiance normally flies Southwest, and he's an incredibly loyal customer, refuses to fly any other airline. So is my future father-in-law. So all that to say, the brand loyalty is not a coincidence. Southwest planned that. It's part of their business model, and people love them for it. So what I realized is that similarly to startups in other industries, entrepreneurship and startups in science and medicine has the potential to solve those two problems that I had witnessed. Where on the one hand, people needed new medicines, and on the other hand, there were potential innovations without necessarily a path to market and to reaching real people. And so in order to understand how powerful biotech, which is how I'm going to refer to entrepreneurship in science, in order to understand how powerful that can be, it's first important that we talk about just a general path of standard drug development and why it is such a difficult industry to innovate in. So what you're looking at here is the path of development for any new medicine, whether that is a biotech company startup or a big pharma company like Pfizer. Every new medicine that comes to the market has to pass through these steps. Those steps are discovery and preclinical. That's discovering a new potential medicine, putting it in preclinical, so non-human testing. So whether that's a petri dish, a test tube, or something of that sort, that's considered preclinical, in addition to animal studies there as well. In order to start a clinical trial, you then have to do an IND filing. And at that point, if that's all successful, you can advance into clinical trials, which is the first point where real people can try your drug. And you finally get to see if it has any measure of efficacy or safety in real people. And so you have your phase 1 trial, and then your phase 2, and then the phase 3. And then if all of those are successful at that point, and only at that point, can you submit what's called an NDA, a new drug application, to the FDA, or a BLA if it's a biologic, to get your medicine approved. And only at that point can you make your first dollar of revenue, if all of that works out. What I want to highlight about this process and the way it traditionally works in pharma companies is 3 things. So number 1, that number at the top, 4%. That's the percent success rate of one new molecule, making it from here all the way to the market. So 96% of those molecules fail. Second, that number at the end, 1.4 billion. That's the average total cost of advancing one new medicine through all of these stages. So of course, that's an astronomically high number, but I want to point out 2 things about it. Number 1, that number is in units of 2013 dollars. So today, that number would be much higher. Second, that number doesn't account for the 4% success rate. So if you capitalize in the cost of failure, which is to say that for every one new medicine that succeeds, 9 fail. If you include the cost of those 9 failures inside that number, it becomes $2.6 billion, also in 2013 dollars. And so if at this point you're thinking to yourself, why would anyone in their right mind ever start a new company that has a 4% probability of success and costs $2.6 billion to make your first dollar of revenue? And that means you're following along. So lastly, I want to highlight the timeline at the bottom. This whole process on average takes between 10 to 15 years. And that's an average, so of course it can be higher than that. And all of these 3 things, the high failure rate, the long timeline, and the high costs to get to market, make this business extremely difficult. And I want to highlight the fact that this is the process regardless of what the science is. And so solid science alone is not enough to overcome some of the inherent difficulties with this process. I also want to say, of course, that we don't want people to just be able to take any new potential therapy willy-nilly. So no one wants to abolish this process. However, we do have to acknowledge that it's difficult to realize that some innovation dies simply because this is a difficult process. And of course, we don't want things that aren't going to be great for people to succeed, but it also means that we're probably losing out on some things that are really good. And so to tell you a little bit about how biotech has historically been innovative and done a great job innovating on this timeline, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a company called Genentech. So Genentech is traditionally thought of as the first biotech company in the sense in which I am using it. It was founded in 1976. And at the time when Genentech was founded, again, good businesses solve problems for people. And the problem at the time was that diabetes, of course, without treatment by insulin, is a deadly disease. And the way they could purify insulin at the time was through literally taking pancreases from cows and pigs and purifying out the insulin and treating people with that. So, of course, not only is that a bit of an imprecise process because you can't necessarily guarantee quality from batch to batch, there's also potentially some supply issues because you're, of course, limited by the number of cow and pig pancreases with viable insulin that are available to you. There's also the problem that your body, of course, is not meant to process cow and pig proteins, and thus there's a not insignificant percentage of allergic reactions that would happen, which could be very dangerous for people. So when Genentech was founded, there is this new technology called recombinant DNA technology that was getting developed in a couple different universities, including UCSF and Stanford. And you're using these recombinant enzymes, and they were able to clone a human gene into this vector and show that bacteria could produce human proteins. Nowadays, this seems like a very basic concept. Almost every molecular biology lab uses this in some form. But at the time, this was kind of this crazy, risky concept because people didn't really believe that a bacterial cell could produce a higher order protein, like a human protein. They didn't think that was evolutionarily possible. But Genentech decided to take a bet on it anyway. And so they took this technology that was at the time only in labs, and they started the company. And of course, they were able to express insulin, which was amazing. And because bacterial cells can be grown in such huge quantities, you can produce huge quantities of insulin. And that's what you see on the right. That's the bioreactor. And what you see on the left is I recommend the book if you're more interested in the story, but long story short, there's a very cumbersome process of cloning back then. And so they had to figure out how to individually express the alpha and beta chains of insulin and get them to come together. And what I want to highlight about this is a couple things. So they were able to get their first drug to market in only 5 years after its founding. Think about that slide I had on last time. That's remarkable. Compare that to the 10 to 15 years that it normally takes. Additionally, this was human insulin, so it totally transformed the way diabetes was treated. Not only does it negate the possibility of these immune reactions that people were having. It also allows a company to produce insulin with consistency and quality and potency in large-scale production. And perhaps most importantly, today, a diabetic individual has the same expected lifespan as a normal, healthy individual. And that speaks to the power of Genentech and what this biotech company was able to accomplish. And so we'll come back to talking about biotech, but to return to my story for a moment, I think we touched on some of this stuff in the intro, but to make a long story short, I realized that biotechnology was this really exciting field to be in, where you could merge science with practical, patient-focused skills. And so I ended up going to business school. I went to University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. So the only school I applied to, I didn't want to move, so I just went right there. And after being there for a couple years, I started working and worked for a few years with a company called Arch Venture Partners. It's one of the top biotech venture groups in the country. And Arch actually started and made the founding investment in the company Illumina, which of course revolutionized the way we do DNA sequencing. It brought down the costs and increased the efficiency extremely well. So Arch is very well known, and it was great to be able to be trained by people who had in some ways created the modern biotech industry. And in early 2020, I had the opportunity to co-found Centivax, where I'm now Chief Business Officer, published the book Building Backwards Biotech, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And a few years ago, I was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for healthcare. So to talk about the book, why did I write it? Two reasons. Actually, probably more reasons, but we'll talk about two of them. I witnessed as a consultant, when I had my own consulting practice, that working with different entrepreneurs, that it wasn't always the best science that succeeded in the forms of companies. And I wondered what actually makes these companies succeed in addition to the strength of the science. And I realized that there is this kind of essential mindset shift that a lot of these academic scientists underwent to become successful entrepreneurs, and I wanted to capture that. And second, I'm someone who was raised by two chemistry PhDs. My mom worked in pharma for my entire life, and I was raised by two scientists. And something I observed throughout my mom's career, this is typical of a larger pharma company, but a lot of times I realized that the business practice of a big company like that was often kind of disconnected from the realities of the science and what the science necessitated, or what the science was suggesting as far as clinical or market direction. And I realized a lot of that disconnect came because scientists are just not trained in business. And so and business people, of course, are not trained in the tech. And so there's this separation. And I wanted to help scientists understand some of the fundamental parts of business, because scientists are the innovators. And if you don't understand how to bring your innovations to people, they're not going to make it to people. And so I wanted to write a book to offer out that knowledge to people like you. So the book's called Building Backwards because over the course of 30 plus interviews and hundreds of hours interviewing with industry leaders, this theme, this mindset shift I touched on, called Building Backwards, emerged. And building backwards is building with the end in mind, defining your end goal early on, which enables you to more easily optimize your path to success. Now, to stop for a minute there, this might sound like an oversimplification because, as we all well know as scientists, science basically never behaves the way we predict. However, I want to point out that this is not a step-by-step protocol to put into place, but rather a method of thinking which is adaptable to any unforeseen scientific complication. And additionally, although building backwards is a simple concept, it's particularly easy to botch in science. And that's because science is so uniquely demanding of detailed work and viewing the trees, so to speak, it's sometimes hard to take a step back and see the big picture in the forest. In biotech, then, building backwards is particularly important to consistently ponder in order to spur constant refocusing on an end goal. And especially in business, this end goal is important to be thinking about in a way that is perhaps less directly crucial than academia. What I mean by that is a lot of times in academia, you have the ability to follow the science wherever it may lead you. One research question can easily add to 50 more. And it's a good thing to go down all of those rabbit holes and understand the system in its entirety. In business, you don't have the ability to do that. Your goal is an end product. And so what that means is it requires scientists who have this academic training to take a different approach. And sometimes that approach can feel very weird, but it's essential to make a business successful. And to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about an example, a case study of a company that I consulted with back in the day called M Therapeutics that did not build backwards. And in order to understand the story, it's first important that I touch on a basic reality in the financial life of a biotechnology company, which is to say that biotechnology companies, unlike normal non-science companies, increase not in value, not in a kind of linear fashion, but in a stepwise manner in line with which phase of development the company is in. And so, for example, a preclinical company is valued much lower than a phase 1 company, which is much lower than a phase 2 company, which is much lower than a phase 3 company, and so on. And there's these steep value inflection points that increase the value of your company. The implication of this for any company is that whenever you raise money, you want to be thinking about how to reach the next value inflection point to create value with your data in the company, increasing the value of the company by increasing the evidence for it and decreasing the risk. And there's math behind that I can talk about if you're interested in the Q&A section. But in any case, the goal in biotech is advancing through these stages of development efficiently and not burning through capital in a non-strategic, non-value increasing way. In any case, M Therapeutics was developing a new therapy for treating stage 4 cancer. The work involved repurposing 2 previously approved FDA drugs, which were approved for use in 2 independent indications. And because of compassionate use protocols, which you're able to do in cases like stage 4 cancer, and because these drugs had already been approved, the PI of this company had already been able to prove that this protocol, repurposing these 2 drugs, worked and had been able to bring terminal patients into remission. And although it's certainly a debatable question whether or not repurposing 2 drugs is a great premise for a new company, I'd like to stay away from that discussion for now in order to focus on the higher example of what happens when they did not build backwards. So what happened is that instead of focusing on increasing the value of their company in a strategic way, as I want to point out, they had a uniquely simple path forward because they were working with 2 previously approved drugs with years of human data that were known to be safe. And so although there was some preclinical work that needed to be done, it could have been relatively focused, some synergistic mechanism studies, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, the leadership of the company focused on obtaining really perfect publication-worthy sort of data over months at first and then years. The company hired 20 to 30 lab full-time employees, which in and of itself isn't bad, but again, remember the goal here, advancing into the clinic as quickly as possible. And because they spent so much time and capital doing this without making any tangible progress within 5 years, the company failed, not because the science failed. They failed because they ran out of money. They were no longer able to raise because the company was not advancing. So at each step, the company did not build backwards. They were focusing on a step in the process, obtaining good preclinical data, which again, in and of itself is not bad, but they lost sight of the broader end goal. They did not build backwards to think about where they were actually going and what the point of those specific experiments were in the full grand scheme of the drug development process. Next, I'm going to talk about a company called Centivax. That's a great example of a company that did build backwards and was able to do so effectively. So Centivax is a Japanese biotechnology company, and they decided to build backwards towards the end goal of getting a new schizophrenia medicine approved. And so for those of you who are not familiar, schizophrenia is a serious mental disorder in which people interpret reality abnormally. there's two sets of symptoms. There's positive symptoms, which are delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. And then there's negative symptoms, which is flattened affect, reduced speech, and lack of initiative. And the theory is that dopamine dysregulation is what underlies these symptoms. And so the way schizophrenia is currently treated is with this group of currently approved drugs. What I want you to notice is that all of them target this receptor, the dopamine 2 receptor, as its primary target. And this is effective at alleviating the positive symptoms, but it's often for patients incompletely effective at alleviating the negative symptoms. And a lot of patients have reported that the negative symptoms are actually more debilitating for them than the positive symptoms. Additionally, targeting this receptor comes with a host of negative side effects that are difficult and debilitating for patients. And so Synovion looked at the market because, again, remember what I told you at the beginning, a good business is solving a problem for people. And they realized that there is this hole in the market, that even though we have this many schizophrenia drugs approved, there is a need for one for patients that treated the negative symptoms and didn't cause these side effects. And so that was a very specific problem towards which to build backwards. And so they realized that there is this market need, and they engineered the most efficient science they could think of in order to get there. And so what they decided to do is they used this novel assay, this phenotype assay, where they actually started in mice and threw, quote unquote, 1,000 or so compounds into this animal model. We're able to analyze the animal's behavior and see which of these molecules were impacting the negative symptoms. And then they took that group of molecules and sent it through a second screen, just a simple binding assay, to see which of those molecules wouldn't bind the D2 receptor. Because again, remember, the first part was to make sure it worked on negative symptoms, or looked like it would work on negative symptoms. And the second part was to try and avoid the negative side effects by modulating the D2 receptor. And the result of that was this molecule over here, uluterant. And today, uluterant has reached the notable milestone of entering phase 3 clinical trials. That's all the way to the right of that diagram I showed before. And the results from these phase trials have demonstrated that this molecule leads to a significant improvement in negative symptoms compared to placebo. Further, there's lower rates of side effects compared to currently approved drugs that target D2. And of course, like I said before, when you're solving a problem for people and there's a market need for it, the money tends to follow. And so they received nearly $890 million for selling the rights to this big pharma company to co-develop this drug with them. And this is the power of building backwards. Although it's certainly true that that particular assay and that particular methodology is not going to be useful for most, if not any other situation, the point here is not the assay. The point is that because they were focused on a particular scientific outcome and market outcome towards which to build, they were able to build backwards and think about how to harness novel scientific assays to get there expediently. And so building backwards can be a really powerful tool to spur constant refocusing on the end goal. And I do talk more about the specifics of how you can apply that in the book. To go over a couple of them, here's 5 principles for all of you guys who are interested in starting your own companies. And something I always tell people is that actually your company, the best way to increase the success of your company is to build backwards towards all these traits that investors and the market success factors, all of those things on day one when you're starting the company. Instead of starting any company and trying to position it the right way, it's actually better to start a company thinking about all of these things in the first place. And those things that will ultimately matter, of course. Number 1, end market size and the market landscape. As scientists, it's weird to think about a new medicine like a cancer drug to that in the sense of money and markets. But if you don't think about it like that, I'm not talking about the ethics here, but just that's the way the system works. And if you don't think about it like that, you're unlikely to succeed. And think about also the M Therapeutics example. The sad part of that story is not only that a company failed, the sad part of that story is actually more that this treatment that seemed to work for stage 4 cancer did not move forward, and it was not further tested because they did not create the basic business infrastructure to make that happen. And so end market size is really important because your investors will look at your company on day one. They will think about how big can my exit possibly be if I put in 10 million today and the company sells for 100 million, best case scenario, is that a good enough return for me? And the example I just gave, probably not. So it's important to ask that question on day one so you can think about whether the economics actually make sense for an investor. Second, and also just another quick thought on that. A lot of times people, when they're starting companies, your market isn't actually what you think it is. So for example, I had someone send me a deck on lipid nanoparticles and this novel lipid nanoparticle platform that they created. I have lots of opinions about it that I won't go into. But the point is, he sized the market as cancer is a huge problem and we're going to use this for cancer and look how big the cancer market is. But that's not actually accurate because you are not the cancer drug. You are a component of the cancer drug. You are a delivery mechanism. And so the more accurate way to size that market is to think about the existing market of lipid nanoparticles and what fraction of that market you might be able to get. Second, differentiated. While any innovation has the potential to help people, not all innovation makes a good new company. So if you're going to start a new company around a new technology, you would ideally like to find one that is 10x figures of merit better on more than one axis. And so, for example, it's not enough to just be, a new mechanism of delivery. It also needs to be 10 times more efficient, 10 times cheaper, 10 times more effective. You need to have multiple measures of better, and it has to be much better, not just a little bit. Third, strategic science. So again, the example of M Therapeutics. A lot of biotech companies die because they end up kind of spinning their wheels for years and years and years, and investors and the market moves so much faster than academia does. That was one of the biggest things I noticed, is that academic time is long and startup time is very short. So in a year, if you haven't made progress, that's already kind of old news for an investor. And so making that strategic scientific decision about which data is most crucial to de-risk your company and either validate or disprove your hypothesis is an important question to ask. And in academia, a lot of times we shy away from getting negative data because you can't publish it. It's uninteresting if you unwind your whole hypothesis. But actually in biotech, you want to ask those questions that have the potential to disprove everything, because if it succeeds, that means an investor will view you as more de-risked. And it also means that it's worth garnering greater investment into. And think about that value inflection point chart. Fourth, team. I could go into more detail about this, but essentially you want a team that an investor will view as investable with credibility. Number 5, intellectual property. Again, I could talk about this a little bit more if you guys have questions, but in short, file first and then publish if you think you're going to create a company. If you publish, talk about, tweet about, share an abstract about, or somehow in any way put a little bit of your research in the public domain, that's great, good for research, but you can't turn it into a company if it's not a patent. And sometimes this is like a weird thing for academics because it sounds like what I'm saying is don't share your science, which is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when you are planning to share your science, plan ahead and file a provisional patent with the Tech Transfer Office before you do so. So I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but really quickly, I wanted to talk about what our company is doing. It's a very simplified set, so not the slide set we present to investors, but just to give you a little bit of an overview. So our company is called Centivax. We are a broad spectrum vaccine company. So universal vaccines. Universal is not like an incredibly precise word, so we don't really use it. But again, problem solution match. So the problem that we're solving is that, of course, mutating viruses cause our vaccines to fail. Viruses mutate faster than we can create new vaccines to address them. And that's true for coronavirus, as we've all seen, but it's also historically true for influenza. And this is a chart of how the influenza antigens have changed over the centuries. And so to talk specifically about influenza, in 90 years, our vaccines are unpredictably matched to seasonal strains in terms of their efficacy. Each season, CDC and HWO and whoever else is assigning which strain of interest there is. They are guessing what the predominant strain will be in the following flu season. And so you get a flu shot and it may or may not actually help you. And the efficacy hovers somewhere around 30%. So for us, we expect to be in the 90% range. And the way that technology works is by harnessing focusing your immune system on conserved epitopes on the virus. And can talk more about that if you're interested. But essentially, the solution is a broad spectrum vaccine to address future strains of flu, and would be like 1 or 2 shots. We've been able to raise $10 million in financing to date in the form of a safe note. This is a seed round. So this is our formal venture investment so far. But we've also raised $14.5 million in non-dilutive grant financing through various organizations. So as you can see here, we have multiple Army collaborators military collaborators in terms of the Army, the Navy, and others. We also are supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Charles River Labs and NIH. This is our leadership team slide, which I won't dwell on, but it's a great group of people to be working with. And this is not our currently relevant chart, but I wanted to show this to give you an idea. This is how we have to think about product development as a company. We have to, when we're raising money, think about where each dollar is going to get us in terms of getting our product into the clinic and thus closer to market tangibly. And so these are all the different things we have to do and how much it costs and how long it's going to take. And this is something we have to carefully think about and keep ourselves in line with. In any case, I'm very happy to have joined you guys today. And if you want to get in touch with me, that's my email. And the book's on Amazon if you're interested. And at this point, I'd be happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you. Yes. That's a great question. So for anyone online who couldn't hear that, the question was about a lot of layoffs in biotech recently and how they as students should be thinking about it. And I would just say that's true. It's a very difficult financing environment right now. So a lot of that is because of that. However, I'd say there's still a very big need for talent. And so if you as a student are able to get experience or internships or some understanding of biotechnology, like from this coursework, for example, under your belt, that allows you to be helpful to a new company. And there's a huge need for talent to source these biotechnology companies, especially in places like that are not San Francisco and Boston and are flooded with people that want to get into this industry. So in general, I say it's definitely the case that there's been a lot of layoffs recently, but I think the great thing about biotech is because people are always going to need new medicines and people are always going to be sick. This is not in as completely correlated to market moves as different industries are. That's generally what we think. And so biotech will always be around. It's always going to need people, whether that's this year or next year or a couple years from now. And if you acquire those skills, you will be very interesting and definitely desirable to a biotech company. Yes. So the question was about some of the military grants and whether someone with those connections is looked at favorably. Yes, I'd say yes in general. with some asterisks. I know that's definitely your situation. So going back to our org chart, this guy in the middle, Sir, was the lead virologist at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases and did research in DoD and all of that for years and years. So he's one of our older team members, and he's been invaluable with connecting us to non-dilutive funding opportunities, which has been incredibly helpful. But I would say I'm not totally in line with what those opportunities are to gain those sort of top level connections as a new student would be. I'm sure, further down the career path, depending on who you work with and who you meet and the people that, you're in class with today could be the top ranking person 15 years from now. I think those connections, generally speaking, tend to be more and more valuable with time, but I wouldn't say never. And then to answer the second half of your statement, I would say that it's a bit of both between the private and public kind of paradigm you painted. So for our company and for many, you start out with a lot of non-dilutive grant financing in the early stages, actually. And the reason for that is because you need some proof of concept data, and it's very expensive to be giving away equity when your valuation is really low. And so the non-dilutive funding can be extremely helpful at that stage. It's also easier to win a phase 1 SBIR grant than it is to win later stages. So it's easier to do some of those earlier, it's easier to win a grant typically for those earlier stages. Although we have a grant expert over here you could ask more questions of later. We're talking about that at breakfast. And I think although it's possible to get kind of this larger support in very expensive late stage trials for phase 2 and 3, that is also kind of difficult. So I generally say if we're trying to look at a financing path, and also just to clarify, these are not the people financing it. These are our partners. So for example, Auburn University is not giving us money. They are kind of in some ways acting as an academic collaborator for a study. We are actually paying them for that. But in general, if we wanted a map, it tends to be with more small stage grants at the beginning, venture investment in the middle, and then partnerships and pharma and bigger companies coming in to do the later stage trials, often eventually acquire you, and then they do the marketing and distribution themselves. While it's definitely possible to get a huge grant like from BARDA, which is a military agency, because they, for example, gave tons of money during the COVID pandemic to advance different vaccines with different private companies. They have deep pockets in that sense. They're very picky. They only fund few companies and only companies with the ability to kind of do those later stage studies. Yes, back there.
A two-part question from one of our virtual attendees. What are your thoughts on digital therapeutics as an emerging disruptor to traditional pharmaceutical treatments? And how do you think this might affect the drug development industry?
Thanks for the question. So I think everyone heard that, hopefully, but it was about digital therapeutics. And I, of course, work at a vaccine company, so I'm not seeing, I will caveat this by saying I'm not seeing digital therapeutics every day these days, but I did do a study on them for a large multi-billion dollar corporation back in the day, so I have some familiarity with it. What I'll say is that in general, the number of opportunities there seems to be and is lower and the competition is higher. There are also fewer investors that fund those sorts of companies at this stage. That could change if this becomes more popular and more investors decide they want to go into it. But investors that are really good at evaluating a new molecule are not the same investors that are used to looking at a digital therapeutic, which is often like a phone app, which, although clinically validated, they're not necessarily used to thinking about. So an example of a digital therapeutic, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is there's a video game for kids with ADHD that has been clinically proven to help them improve their ADHD. But there's very few companies that have been super successful. When I looked at the funding trends for this a couple years ago, there were only like 3 or 4 firms doing it. There were probably like 5 financing rounds only that I could find, whereas in biotech, there's like hundreds and hundreds every year. And so the scale is just different. So digital therapeutics certainly work, but I would say it's a different set of investors, at least at this point, from what I know, that are interested in those opportunities. And it's also different people developing them than develop your traditional kind of biotech therapeutic sort of play. So it exists, but it's a very emerging industry. But one thing I will say is pharma companies seem to be interested. Again, more competition because there's just more there's fewer spots in their pipeline to adopt some of these things, and there's a lot of competition because it's easier in some ways to do digital therapeutics, but pharma loves it. They can get reimbursed for it. It's not as like expensive and risky as a new molecule. It's also really good because FDA has recently, in the last like 5 to 10 years, come out with new regulations around software as a medical device. So there's actually a regulatory pathway just for that, because FDA has realized that you don't need to kind of have this fully built product the way you do for a molecule, because with software you can iterate. And that's really important and helpful in this field, especially because back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, where there was first starting to be some innovation in software that was in the medical landscape and had to go through FDA like forced them to do it as like hardware and medical devices, and the regulatory pathway for medical devices is really tough and it's really expensive and sometimes hard to justify if your market size isn't big enough. So the fact that FDA is kind of coming to the modern age and changing some of their regulatory approaches for that, I think will also open up the landscape. So in short, I think there's some opportunities there, but it's still a very emerging industry. Yes.
Wondering, would it be beneficial for us in a Masters of Biotech program to get an MBA on top of what we already have, or would it be considered redundant to those professionals in the field?
That's a great question. So I think you only caught half of that. So just to repeat it for those of you who are online, she asked about an MBA and whether that would be helpful if you already have a master's in biotech. So I would say it depends. To elaborate, I think it depends on what you want to do. If you are interested in being a chief scientific officer, you for sure need to go get a PhD, and it doesn't really matter if you have an MBA to go do that. It's way more important to kind of acquire the experience and skill sets you need to bring a new drug from discovery all the way into the clinic, and ideally beyond that. If you want to be more like me and be a business person, then yes, I think it's certainly very, very helpful. If you want to be a CEO, it's very, very helpful. I don't think an MBA is ever fully necessary, but I think learning some of the skill sets, such as interpreting financial statements and thinking about negotiations and thinking about strategy, is very important to get, but I don't think you necessarily have to get an MBA. For me, I really wanted to do it because I wanted to get further graduate school education, and also being kind of a beginner to this field, it was frankly just helpful to have letters validating my experiences. But throughout my MBA, I kept working, and I would say I learned the most about biotech and business and negotiations and all of that from actually doing it. But the MBA is a credibility signal, and objectively in biotech especially, there's a huge amount of degree inflation because you're working with someone from like Harvard Medical School who has like an MD, PhD, MBA. I've met that person a couple times. They exist. And so it helps to have some letters like that. But with that said, our leadership team, Dave Sau, who's our COO, just has multiple years of experience at Pfizer with drug development, but he just has a master's, and he's great, just as knowledgeable as many PhDs, if not more. Our CEO, Jake, actually worked at Pfizer for a very long time and started his company, and then decided to go get a PhD in parallel to starting it, realizing he needed more credibility. But short answer is, I think there are some objective skill sets you can get from an MBA, but I am a big proponent of not just going to get a degree to get a degree. I would build backwards. I would think very carefully about where you're trying to get with your career, how exactly a master's or an MBA or a PhD or an MD or whatever you're thinking about doing is going to tangibly get you there. And don't just guess like, oh, I think you need an MBA to do it. Like, actually go talk to people that are 20 years ahead of you and ask them, what do you think you need to like get to where you are? Because I want to be where you are. And go find those people that have kind of made it to where you want to be, and then build backwards to figure out the objective skill sets in addition to the degrees that will get you there, and think very carefully about what exactly you want out of any degree you decide to do. Because I think too often it just feels safer to go down these paths where we sign up for a degree because it's like this kind of like comfortable, it's hard work, but it's also in some ways a comfortable path to be told first you spend 4 years doing this, and then, we'll hand you this piece of paper and you've succeeded. And sometimes that can be like easier and feel safer than actually taking the risks of going out into the workforce and trying to acquire some of these skills for yourself. So I would just be cautious of that. And again, depends on where you want to go exactly.
Hi, hi, Stephanie.
Oh, sorry. You go first and then I'll move to you.
Sure. I had a question on how venture capitalists sort of view biotech and bio-inspired startups
Could
post.
you speak up? I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I just wanted to ask you how you think venture capitalists sort of view biotech startups post sort of Theranos. What do you think is their view, and has it sort of impacted their sort of general sense of acceptance of biotech startups?
The question was just about Theranos and how I think it's impacted the field. In short, I don't really think there's much of a lasting impact. And here's why. Theranos broke the standard biotech startup mold in pretty much every single way. Biotechs are just like academia in the sense that we really value peer review. Peer review of science matters in industry just as much as in academia. Publishing is a priority. And when you get government grants, that's also a measure of peer review. And Theranos didn't have any of their work undergo that process. And so that was highly unusual. Also, every single person on the board of Theranos and in management at Theranos basically was not an expert in the field. And that's the exact opposite of how most venture capitalists and biotech companies build their companies. You don't just get big names from government. You actually go out and say, okay, who's a vaccine expert for my vaccine company that I can recruit to come look at this and be an advisor? So I don't think I have the slide here, but we have like a big slide of all of our scientific advisory board members who are all in and of themselves successful scientists that get to look at our data very closely under NDA and give us feedback and have thoughts about it. And then they like consent, so to speak, to be like on our website as our advisors. And so all of that Theranos did was highly unusual. I will say that I'm sure there are some implications for other companies that were going towards a similar problem as Theranos. So other companies that were trying to do microscopic blood sample testing, I'm sure that there was some sort of impact. I did work with a company called Quanterix. I wrote a case study for Harvard Medical School on a company called Quanterix that came about around the same time as Theranos, and they were also a blood testing company, and they could measure proteins in like very, very tight ranges, like low concentrations. And at first, when they were going out to raise, they would constantly get questions about like, well, why are you better than Theranos, or how are you better than Theranos? And this was before anything with Theranos happened. And his answer was always, well, like, here's our data. We are built on data. We're peer reviewed. Like, here's how many publications we've put out. Like, look at all these clinical studies we've done. And Quanterix is doing really well right now because of that. So I would just say in general, I think Theranos was like a big splashy warning story about different things that can happen in Silicon Valley. And there are some truths to that. Like, there is definitely a culture in biotech and in all startups, I think, that's credibility signaling, which is that VC firm A with a really splashy name invests in your company. And so VC firms like B through Z just assume your company must be good. And so they pile in. There's also reason by association. So for example, like you sign a partnership with a company like Pfizer, which Theranos lied about. And then people are like, oh, Pfizer has a bunch of really smart people. And if they think it's good, it must be good. So then people jump in. And I think that's only natural in some ways. VCs are looking at, when I was at Arch, I was looking at tens of decks in a day for different companies, if not more than that. And you just don't have time to go into the details on all of them. So if there's a company where you know a really well-known venture capitalist is in it and they are a reputable biotech person, then it's natural to jump in. However, again, one more nuance about Theranos, all of their investors were not actually biotech investors. And what most people don't realize is that, you see Shark Tank or whatever, and new like potato chip company gets up there and has to have like this like really splashy, cheesy pitch about their new chips. And like the investor's like, wow, your elevator pitch was boring, so I'm not investing. Like, that culture is really not as much of a thing in biotech. Biotech investors are scientists first and foremost. And so what they care about is data. You don't need to spend a lot of time being cute about like convincing them cancer is a problem. And so most biotech investors want to see your data. They care primarily about your data. And most of your conversation with them is about the data, albeit through a market lens. And so Theranos didn't undergo any of that. They just kind of got investors that didn't know how to properly audit that. And so very long-winded answer, but I don't see a lot of long-term implications for the Theranos story, although perhaps there are some in terms of, young women without tons of experience and credibility and college dropouts, like getting up there and running companies. And perhaps that's unfortunate or has some negative downsides, but I think for the biotech industry, there's not these huge, broad, sweeping implications that people might think there are. Did you have a question? Biotech's like startup landscape. Yeah, so she asked me how the recession is going to affect biotechs and the startup landscape. And I'd say it's going to, and it has. It's been a very difficult fundraising environment. There's been a lot of layoffs. And it's kind of unclear right now when this cycle will end, if it's going to get worse, if it's going to get better. No one really knows. I think general thoughts are right now, most of the VC firms, the big VC firms, raised a lot of money in kind of the big years like 2020, 2021, and still have money. So the thought is they have money, but they're sitting on it and they're being pickier about their investments. And so that could change the longer this goes on. So I'll say I see that there's still investments happening, but they're pickier and happening less. And so what that probably means is there's a little bit more scrutiny of companies that are getting funded. So generally speaking, it implies that the company that makes it out of the other side must be extra, extra good, because there's not this like culture of so much cash in biotech like there was a couple years ago. But it also means that there's some really good companies that probably aren't going to make it through this. And we've already seen that starting to happen. And so that's sad, but it's also a reality of just the cycles of the economy and how it lines up with biotech. But like I said before, to end on a hopeful note, I do believe, and this is the general thought in the industry, that again, because medicines are a thing that people are always going to need and always be interested in getting more of, thus there will always be some money there. There will never be no biotech and no innovation, regardless of how bad the economy gets. And the money in biotech is correlated with the market, but not as tightly as other industries. Yes. Also, sorry, I realized I skipped you, so I'll come back to you.
So, in what ways were your responsibilities as a part of a consultants company and being a part of a co-founding a company were different? How were the different?
Sure, that's a great question. He asked about my responsibilities in consulting and forming a company. So it depends. Again, it changes a lot on the client. So when I'm not actively consulting right now, just to clarify, the business is open. Basically, the only thing it does is collect like $1 every time I sell a book on Amazon. Uh, but when I did have multiple clients, I did all sorts of things for them. And one piece of advice I'll give to all of you students is that I think sometimes people, when they join a startup or a new company or really any organization or a lab, throw that in there for the professors, or new person coming to a lab, you kind of have this idea of like, I'm too important to be the one to like make the buffer, or I'm way too important to be the one to like break down the cardboard boxes, or to go back to biotech for an example, to to write the grants because it sucks. No one likes writing grants. Doesn't get better in biotech. But like if you are the team player and you're the one who's willing to do what the company needs or the lab needs that's outside of your job description, that goes a really long way. So if you want to be a young person that succeeds anywhere, including biotech, having a I'll do anything that needs to be done sort of attitude is going to get you really far. And that is definitely what I aimed for when I was getting started. And I think that really helped me. So I first got started actually, I wrote this book. Before this, I wrote a lot of scientific articles when I was in school. I really liked teaching, so I taught the MCAT for a while. I also taught organic chemistry when I was in college as a tutor, and just learning how to break down kind of esoteric concepts in a way that people can understand really helped me. And so at first, a lot of these startup companies wanted me to help them with their grant writing because I can write. And I hate grant writing, but that's what they needed, and that's what I did. And, you know, once you start to gain that trust, you write one grant, and then they're like, oh, can you also, look over this, like, you know how to read financial statements, right? Can you look at this and see like what you think about XYZ? And, I look at it, I give my thoughts, and he goes, oh, okay, that went pretty well. Like, do you want to outline our pitch deck? And I said, oh yeah, of course I can do that. So the point being, you might come in as one thing, and if you can have an attitude of this is just a good opportunity for me to learn and to be helpful to this organization or this lab or whatever, you will be handed more and more responsibility. And that's definitely what I experienced, especially at a young age. In my particular job now, it went like that too, but it was more because there were very many of us and there's a lot to do. So I'll focus on right now because I can barely think about what I did 3 years ago. But right now, what I'm largely in charge of is the funding. As the chief business officer, I oversee our accountant who manages the day-to-day transactions, but I'm looking at our cash flow. I'm preparing us and the CEO for our board meetings where we present to our investors where we are in terms of how much cash we have and where that's going to get us in terms of value. And I'm building the pitch decks. I'm setting up meetings with pharma companies because something that biotech companies can really benefit from is the cash that pharma companies have, as well as kind of the stamp of approval that they'll get, that it comes with if you get a partnership. So I am basically always organizing, soliciting, or meeting with pharma companies at something. And our pitch is also constantly evolving as we get more data, as we realize, we give the pitch and then we're always getting asked about manufacturing. We're obviously not addressing that well enough in the pitch. We have to rethink the pitch and add that in. So I'm constantly giving feedback about that as well. This particular day, I'm supposed to be writing a phase 2 SBIR. Instead, I'm standing right here. So that will be my homework for this weekend. That's what I can think of right now, but there's probably more. Yes.
There's an AI-based RNA drug discovery. I started like a few months ago, like a Stanford startup called Atomic AI, and they have already discovered a new protein that have never existed. How do you forecast the future research-based job in therapeutics?
So just to be clear on the question, I couldn't hear you super well. You're asking about how AI-based protein therapeutics will factor into the job market, or?
Yes, that was my question.
Okay. Well, I will answer that a little bit broadly at first, and then let me know if you still have a question. I'm not familiar with that particular company. As I've, kind of gotten focused on Centivax, I am a little bit less up on the newest innovations than I was when I was in VC. However, I'll say generally speaking, there is definitely a move towards computational tools in biology. And so if you are someone who can code, understands that, and wants to garner a skill set in that area, I think that is very smart and strategic, and that will make you very valuable to a company, because there is, much like my value add a lot of times to biotech companies, is that I have some foundational understanding of science, and then I also, know the business side. Someone who understands the computational aspects but also understands biology is really, really valuable right now. So that's a very general way to put it, but our company also uses computational tools, and that's something I've noted as well, is that there is a lot of interest in that, and there's a lot of VC firms, they call themselves tech bio, So if you're interested in going into that for a job, you can look for tech bio companies or tech bio VCs. But before you do that, or perhaps in parallel as you look for jobs there, you can gain that skill set in molecular biology, but also in the computational aspect, because if you come to the market with both of those skills, it's very valuable. Yeah.
And this is going to be our last question
Okay.
as well, as we're out of time.
How do you think biotech companies have been affected by the fall of Silicon Valley Bank like last week, and how do you think the gap could be met, or what is the whole like procedure of kind of fixing the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think everyone heard you, so thanks for speaking up. Silicon Valley Bank, in short, too soon to tell. I think if the Treasury hadn't bailed out Silicon Valley Bank, there was a lot of concern and consternation over financings, because not only did a lot of biotech companies keep their money there, a lot of investors kept their money there. And if the investors don't have access to their funds, they cannot finance new rounds. And if companies don't have access to their funds, then they can't meet payroll, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of consternation then. At this point, it's a little bit hard to tell how this will play out in the long term. There's definitely already a lot more concern around banking and where you bank and how much you're holding in cash and how much you have in bonds and that sort of thing that like no one cared about like 3 weeks ago. So my last board meeting just happened like 3 days after this. So I had to like scramble. So again, this is the like can do anything sort of attitude. I grabbed my friend who's the chief technology officer who I work with, and like the two of us just like showed up to Wells Fargo, and they're like, don't worry, like we don't have any money in Silicon Valley Bank. We're like, great, that's not why we're here. So we like sat down with the financial advisor and was basically had to come up with like a rough plan to present to the board about this is what we're going to do with our cash. This is how we're going to hold it. Da, 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 da. And like that wasn't something we were going to have to talk about before that. However, I will say longer term things to watch for is that Silicon Valley Bank was one of the few places that was willing to give cash constrained startups loans. So the way loans work outside of startups, just to like touch on that for a second, is like much like when you get a loan on your house, you have something tangible that you can get a loan on because it's a tangible asset. So companies that have capital equipment like airlines, it's a lot easier for them to get debt because they have, equipment and tangible things that they can use. Also, companies that have a history of revenue or a certain amount of cash or a certain expectation of revenue, all of that can be used to get loans. Silicon Valley Bank did loans to startups that had none of that. So for a biotech company, you basically never hear about them getting loans because there's no tangible assets. Your only asset is a patent, and it's really not that valuable in the scheme of like trying to sell it or prove to a bank that it matters. And so Silicon Valley Bank was one of the few groups that were willing to give startups like biotechs loans like that. And loans can be really beneficial because if you're, for example, needing to do a key experiment or like bridge yourself a couple months before your Series A round or some such, it's if you don't have access to that cash, like you could go under. And so again, it's too soon to say really how this will play out in the long run, but where I hear most of the concern coming in is around that. Thank you.